What's up, guys? Coming at you here with a book review. And if the algorithm helps, then perhaps some folks that are reading this book for school might be able to get some tips and tricks from this video here. I decided to re-listen to the book Crime and Punishment. I hadn't read it since high school, but it came to my attention again, and I thought I'd give it a listen. And honestly, this book was a lot better than I remember it being. It's not perfect, but I do want to discuss it and go over some of the components that I really enjoyed, but I'll still criticize some components of it and give it a grade. So to give some background on this book, it was written by Fyodor Dostoevsky back in the late 1800s in Russia. Dostoevsky led a very difficult life, and this book is trying to just paint a picture of how tortured a location Russia was at that time, and how a crumbling society lays the groundwork whereby murderers and other criminals come to be. And while the book is obviously trying to state that such behavior is wrong and inexcusable, like many things in life, it is important that we keep in mind the context in which certain groups or factions or individuals commit certain crimes or human rights violations or any number of actions that we may view as intolerable or out of the question or just pure evil. It's important for us to recognize that these behaviors don't exist in a vacuum. And this book follows a former law student named Raskolnikov who is in dire poverty, is living by himself, and is suffering. And ultimately, he commits the ultimate crime. He commits a double homicide. He utilizes a number of methods to try and justify his actions and claim that he's justified in taking out this pawnbroker who's treated him horribly, and he's even overheard from other people saying that she's a menace and a leech on society. And that component of the book, wow, I must say, the first part, this book's split into different parts. Part one of this book is riveting. The prose and the descriptions, the narration really flows seamlessly off the pages, and it really holds your attention. And that is a credit to the writing and the translation. It's translated, it must have been translated very well, because it is great writing. I will say, though, that there are a few components where, especially in the later parts of this book, where it gets a bit too off into the weeds, and there's just so much back and forth and discussion. And I also feel that there's maybe a few too many characters, and it's a little hard to keep track of everyone. Those are definitely a few standout negatives where the story just drags. And frankly, after part one, there's nothing that is as exciting as part one. Everything after that is kind of, it's while it has moments of greatness, it's not all around wonderful. It's a lot like Band of Brothers. It starts off phenomenal. Episodes 1 and 2 of Band of Brothers are some of the best things ever put on TV. And after that, it's okay. It's got some moments of greatness and the rest is fine. I'd say that's kind of how a lot of this book is. Now, I will say that perhaps a better choice of class of protagonist would have made the story work a little bit. While you do really buy the suffering and miserable situation that Raskolnikov finds himself in, just the idea that a former law student, of all people, could suddenly jump to murdering someone feels a bit of a leap in logic. But perhaps from the author's point of view, he wouldn't have been able to bring in some other components of his reasoning and dialogue and the corruptibility and ramblings of man if it were from a less educated protagonist. Either way, it still feels like feels like a leap to me. And while there might be some critics that say that this book is dangerous because it might plant the ideas of crime in people's minds, I don't really buy that. I think that, hello, if you're sensible enough to find yourself reading a book, especially this book of all of them, and let's be real, in the world we live in today, not to sound prideful, but we're probably a minority. I don't think a lot of people are reading that many books these days, unfortunately. Hopefully, we're helping to dispel that and get people to read more. But if you are sensible enough to sit down and read or listen to this lengthy book, then you're probably sensible enough to not commit crime. At least I would assume so. I would hope so. I imagine that mostly criminals just kind of operate on autopilot because they're in such dire straits. And if anything, this book deters crime because it brilliantly demonstrates the mental suffering of criminals. Just the anguish and suffering that Raskolnikov goes through is profound and it would deter anyone from making as stupid as a mistake as he does. You could even argue that Raskolnikov himself perished along with the two people he killed that day. Actually, apparently, depending on the translation of the book you read, some of the translations state that the second woman he killed was pregnant. So, in that sense, anywhere from 3 to 4 people did not walk out of that room, out of that apartment flat. The Raskolnikov that conspired and pretended he was a great man above the law perished alongside with his victims that were components of his twisted ego and social experiment. It really highlights the notion that we're not really punished for our sins per se, we're just punished by them. And with that, I want to segue into some of the really great components of dialogue and writing that are found within this book. I'd say that one component that's really interesting is when Raskolnikov visits Sonia and they begin discussing their life behaviors and actions, and they discuss theology, and Sonia is, again, with the desperation, and the book also explains that her family has lost everything. Her father drank away all of their fortunes and even died at a later part in the book, and she has entered into the industry of prostitution. And from that regard, I guess you could argue that both Raskolnikov and Sonia, perhaps they can relate to each other because they've both committed grievous sins, especially from the perspective of the region they're living in at that time, Orthodox Russia. This book really just demonstrates that Russia is and always has been hell on earth, especially for the poor. My goodness. And as Sonia is explaining her behavior and her actions, Raskolnikov, he states that you have betrayed yourself for nothing. And while some might say, what are you doing? How could you say that to her? But I think in truth, he is more speaking to himself. He's reflecting on his actions and realizing what he did has not benefited him in the slightest. In fact, it's made him miserable. But he's kind of still trying to argue that he's a great man, and he's deflecting that to, he's projecting it onto her and accusing her of being a vile sinner. It's hypocritical, but also simultaneously reflective. And then at a later moment, there's some back and forth dialogue between the detective Petrovich and Raskolnikov, and Petrovich is convinced that Raskolnikov has committed the crime, but he lacks some of the evidence to prove so, and he also prefers for Raskolnikov to come forth and confess, because if he does, he'll get a lesser sentence, and he perhaps has enough empathy to, while not pardon Raskolnikov's actions, he's seeking that understanding of why Raskolnikov would do this. And as they're discussing back and forth, and some of the writing is very, very gripping in this section, and what he states to Raskolnikov is, he says that, well, Raskolnikov tries to retort by saying, if I give myself up, then I'm merely betraying myself. And Petrovich says, you could not betray yourself any further. He states that you've already contradicted who you are and betrayed yourself by committing the ultimate crime, by killing someone. And I think that is very, very well put together. Raskolnikov continues to try and justify what he did by saying that he is a great man that's above the law. Perhaps he's like Napoleon. But in truth, he knows that he was merely, honestly, deceived by the philosophies of man and by the devil. And this really led me to reflect on how if Raskolnikov committed this crime and was so morally tortured by it, it makes me wonder how throughout history we've had a number of quote-unquote great men or dictators or leaders that have implemented the destruction of many, many states and peoples or dissidents and lives. And it really led me to reflect on that, of how do so many people sleep at night if they've committed all of these crimes? And it led me to think on something that, and again, I don't know if there's much evidence of this, but perhaps if Raskolnikov hadn't committed the crime himself with his own hands, maybe if he had ordered someone to take out this pawnbroker, then maybe he could have not been as bothered by it, because he himself did not physically commit the crime. And that led me to think on how Many leaders of nations and dictators, perhaps they kept their own physical hands clean and far away from any number of the atrocities they were ordering, and in that sense, they could remove themselves from the guilt. And if anything, add to their power in thinking that they ordered others to commit the murders, but they were not present for it. They didn't pull the trigger or use the hatchet in this case with this book. And I thought about that a lot. I think it's very interesting. Anyhow, those are the main really fascinating components of this book that really help boost it up. But as I mentioned, I feel that there perhaps are a few too many characters. It's a little hard to keep track of everyone. And this leads to a number of exchanges back and forth where there's some lengthy components of dialogue. And while I've noted that some of the dialogue is great, there's other parts where just drones and drones and drones and just never ends. And those parts they really drag the overall delivery of the book and its profound themes. They drag it down. Taking all that aside, this book would be, honestly, probably an A. But with those components in there, and again, as I noted, part one really is the most interesting part of the book, and everything after that doesn't ever reach that level of interest. So, overall, I would say that this book, I would give it a B. Overall, I'd say this book has an important message that when man is left to its own devices in a fallen society and world that is just merciless in its vices and a lack of empathy and community, that people really collapse down to their worst components. And this book has a lot of interesting commentary on the travails and mental anguish of criminals and any number of people that find themselves facilitating immoral behavior. And the book really does seem to illustrate that redemption still exists, but it's not by any means that man can really provide, but it's through the grace of God. And it's through the opportunity for repentance that Sonia explains and points to, that both Raskolnikov and herself are able to become more than their base components and find that forgiveness in their vile actions and behavior. And that is very inspiring.